Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, and welcome to Baking Accessibility and Inclusion into Your Business. My name is Michelle Eisenberg, and I am a program assistant at the NASDAQ Entrepreneurial Center. And for those of you who may not know, the NASDAQ Center is a nonprofit building a better path for entrepreneurs worldwide by improving inclusion, access, and knowledge in entrepreneurship. So as you will see in the chat in a moment, the NASDAQ Center provides programs, resources, and exceptional mentorship to entrepreneurs across all races, industries, and geographies. So definitely make sure to check out those links and resources in the chat. And just a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. First, let us know where you are dialing in from in the chat. We'd love to connect. And second, we are going to open up for live Q&A at the end of the event. So please make sure to submit your questions for us in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen throughout the presentation, and we will try our best to get to all of them. And of course, none of what we do could be possible at the center without all of the amazing support from our sponsors, including NASDAQ, Lehigh University, Bank of the West, Airbnb, KPMG, Wilson Sonsini, Woodruff Sawyer, Microsoft Entrepreneurship for Positive Impact, BPM, and HubSpot for Startups. We are humbled by their contributions and hope you are grateful too. And so before we get started, we always like to launch a couple polls just to see how everyone in the room is doing today. So this first one is going to ask, how are you feeling? Fearful, anxious, surviving, or optimistic? I'll give it a couple moments up there for everyone to think about it, submit a response. Thank you, thank you. All right. I'm going to end this poll and share these results. Optimism in the lead, always nice to see, but we do have some feelings of anxiety and surviving. I'm very confident our conversation and presentation today will help address some of those feelings. And so I'm going to stop sharing this poll and launch the second poll. What is keeping you up at night? Finance, sales, marketing, scale, pivot, team, or surviving? This one tells us a little bit about your current entrepreneurial needs so we can continue to provide relevant content to all of you. Give it another moment. Thank you all for participating. All right, I'm going to end this poll and share these results. Finance, well in the lead, scale and surviving there as well. We will take this into account. Thank you all so much for sharing your thoughts. I'm going to stop sharing that poll. And without any further delay, please join me in giving a warm welcome to our special guest, Nandita Gupta, Accessibility Product Owner at Microsoft. Nandita, thank you so much for being here with us today. I'm super excited for this, and I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you, Michelle. Am I audible?
Yeah, we can hear you. You're coming in great.
Excellent. And is my screen visible?
Looking good.
Awesome. So I'm going to monitor the chat because my hope is this will be a fairly interactive session. Again, feel free to add any comments, questions as we go along. Just, before we get started, I just want everyone to know that this is a safe space. So I'm learning from you as much as you all are learning from me. And this is truly a collaborative effort. So as we really think about baking accessibility and inclusion into our business, I'm just going to take a step back and start with, what does accessibility mean to you? What does inclusion mean to you? Feel free to throw responses in the chat. And while we're waiting, and again, we'll have other moments to also be able to reflect. But, as we're really thinking about this, my goal for today is to be able to share. I'm not a very prescriptive speaker that, oh my goodness, do X and do Y. It's really about raising these questions that I'm hopeful that as you all start thinking about different areas of impact, you all mentioned finance, you all mentioned scale. I almost look at this as, culture really forms the fabric of everything we do in our businesses, in our workplace. And so if we can really use this culture of inclusion and to really be able to impact other areas, right? You mentioned finance, you mentioned scale, there were other things that showed up. So I'm hopeful that you all might walk away with ideas on how to influence those other areas. So as we keep going through this, again, my learning goals for today will quickly touch on what's the value of an inclusive team culture? Why do we even care? Why are we here? Touching a little bit on, how do we really consistently show up with this lens, so to speak? And what are some really actionable steps we can take, regardless of who's on the call? If you're the CEO, the business owner, you're the founder, you're a designer, you're a developer. I almost look at this as an overall framework. And that's really what we'll be talking about today. My goal is to challenge you to really even think of, those day-to-day steps we can take, right? Taking a quick peek at the chat, Herman says, inclusion to me means making sure the target audience is honest and work with me via cooperation. I love that. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And thank you for being vulnerable and sharing that. A little bit about me. Again, I'm Nandita. My pronouns are she, her. I'm an accessibility product owner, product manager at Microsoft. I am a petite Indian woman with long black hair and glasses, and I am wearing a light blue top. And I'm signing in from my Redmond office here near Seattle. I'm really passionate about accessibility, inclusion, and design. How do we even advocate for those who don't have a voice, but also advocate for others to empower them to really use their voice and speak up. I think for me, what really drives me to even advocate for those aspects is, as a woman of color, as a woman with a disability, as someone who shares such an intersectional identity, I know what it feels like to be excluded. I know what it feels like to experience, hey, I don't think I have a seat at the table. When we think about, the business world and being entrepreneurs, how many times do we feel that, hey, I wish I would have been in that room. I wish I would have had a presence there so I could have made this impact or I could have brought up this point. I want you to channel that feeling here today and think about, as we go through this talk, what are some ways in which you can turn that around and really push and support others to help them feel included? How do we really bring more voices to the table? That's what this is going to be about. We talked a little bit about, asking you all on what inclusion means to you. I know Armand responded, but are there any other thoughts here? What does inclusion mean to you? We'll give everyone a quick 10 seconds. I really resonate with what was said in the chat. I think for me, while everyone is still reflecting, inclusion to me is making sure every voice is heard and making sure that every single one of us can show up as their authentic self each and every time. It's making sure that we're not assuming, but really stepping into someone's experience to understand and truly listen. How is someone perceiving information? How are they communicating? How are they feeling? How are we checking in? And really just thinking about how do we really bring more people to the table? And on my screen, I now have a word cloud in the shape of a hand, which showcases and highlights the words of inclusion, diversity, culture, allyship. And all these are different words that come to mind for me. And repeating the response from the chat again, inclusion to me, as Herman said, means making sure the target audience is honest and work with media cooperation. And so really thinking about how does this even tie into your company culture, right? Why should we even care if your business sort of has that culture? Why does it even matter? I mean, I love data. I personally love data. So for me, inclusiveness, it isn't just something nice to have on your team. Research has shown that being on an inclusive team directly enhances performance. Teams with inclusive leaders are 17% more likely to report that they are high performing, 20% more likely to say they make high quality decisions, and 29% more likely to report behaving collaboratively. But let's take a second to think about this. It's not just about the numbers. These changes really form a ripple effect. And what happens is they have far-reaching consequences where it builds more allyship in your team and organization. Employees who work together collaboratively are also more likely to have more impact. This is really crucial. And when we think about the ripple effect, where every act of being intentional about inclusion really steps further and further and further, because you're going to see someone do something that makes you feel included. And then you're going to be like, oh, wait, I can do that and I can pay that forward. I have the power to now bring more people into the conversation. That's what this is about, right? Each and every one of us are going to be able to build this inclusive culture, almost like this fabric. We're all going to weave this fabric together with one act at the time. And when we think about the how do we really consistently show up with inclusion in mind? And I'd love for each and every one of us to reflect back on what this means for our business and our model and our products and how we all show up. Exclusion happens when we tend to solve our problems using our own biases. So today is all going to be challenging our own selves. What are some ways in which we can be more intentional? We all have the best intentions at heart, but there are times that we don't recognize that this could actually be viewed as exclusionary. So when we really start to build awareness around those actions and become more mindful, that's when the magic happens, right? That's when we start realizing that, hey, here's one act or here's one action that I can now change. One example, and firstly, this is something I don't think I had also considered, and this is something that has been a recent learning for me, is, when we're trying to foster this culture of interaction and collaboration and say, we might pick on someone to say, hey, please speak up, what are your thoughts? Our goal there, again, we have the best intention at heart, where our goal there is trying to include someone in the conversation. But on the other hand, if someone's not comfortable, that can actually be detrimental, and it actually has the opposite effect. So being able to preface and really think through a little bit more and being mindful is really valuable. So, as we go further, what we can expect for the next piece, as I mentioned, I'm not someone who's prescriptive to say, oh, you should go do this and you should go do that. I'm just going to raise 3 questions. Super simple. I'm going to ask 3 questions to all of us. I'll share some of my stories and insights. And then I'd love to hear from you on, how do you think you would approach that? So we'll jump right in. The first question I have for you is, how do we empower others to find and use their voice? So going back, our topic is making accessibility and inclusion into your company culture. First step, right? The first question, how do we empower others to find and use their voice? And I don't mean this in the literal sense, right? Like using your voice to communicate, but it really boils down to inclusive communication. Let's take a look. So when we think about this world of virtual meetings, one thing to consider is, are we providing varied means of communication? People have different preferences of being able to communicate. I, for example, I'm going through some wrist issues. It's very difficult for me to type. So I personally prefer to communicate where I could either use my voice, send a quick recording. I just want to be able to avoid typing. I know some of my friends who, may have a very strong accent or might potentially prefer to hey, you know what? I'm just tired. I don't want to talk. I just want to be able to chat. So it's amazing, right? So how you're thinking about different preferences and how people might want to communicate and how this really simply just ties back into your culture. So being able to provide different ways for folks to communicate. And as we're thinking of communication, right, using inclusive language, raise your hand, right? Don't interrupt someone. And it's very similar to when we are in a physical meeting room versus a virtual meeting room. It can get very difficult because you're not necessarily able to even maintain eye contact and gauge body language. So we sometimes have to work a little harder. So use the technology that you have, right? Mute yourself, record meetings. So in case someone couldn't attend because they're in a different time zone or different part of the world, or sometimes people are just having a rough day, they had to walk away, had to take a mental health break, or they had to go pick up their kids. They couldn't make it at that meeting. You want to make sure that they're not feeling excluded. So those are some other really simple ways, right? Utilize chat and providing information in an accessible manner. Include visual descriptions of what's on the screen. Don't assume that everyone can see your screen. And this actually ties back to other outliers, right? So I've been dealing with really bad internet connection all day. And so sometimes I've not been able to see the screen when my colleagues are sharing their screen. And so it really comes in handy when someone describes a chart or describes what's on the screen. For example, now on my screen, I have an image with different people smiling on a virtual meeting that showcases also the diversity of that team. And so what I just did there was I wasn't assuming that someone could see my slide or they could see the transition. And so you want to make sure, even though those small acts of being inclusive can actually really empower others to bring their authentic self to work. And that really brings me into the next question, right? As we talked about communication, how do we empower others to bring their authentic self to work? I'm going to take a quick pause and go back before we jump in. I'm just going to bring us back to this slide. How do we empower others to find and use their voice? I want to hear from you. What resonated? What comes to mind? What is something that you might want to go try? I see Harman has a comment in the chat. How do we empower others to use and find their voice? My answer to your question is to be non-judgmental always, understand their viewpoint, and have a healthy talk on why and agree and disagree with others. I love that. I love that. Again, we talk about open communication and transparency. Thank you for sharing that. And while I'm waiting, if you have any other thoughts, everyone, please feel free to add them in. And we'll move on to the next question. And we'll come back. We'll come back to all of these questions, right? But the second one that I want to touch on is how do we empower each other to bring our authentic self to work? This is super applicable if you're a business leader. Honestly, anyone. You're part of the team, you're part of the culture, right? So as you're thinking about it in your organization, you want your employees and team members to feel comfortable. You don't want them to feel that they have to cover or hide facets of their unique identity. Because it's honestly those pieces that strengthen our workplace and bring such unique and innovative ideas to the table. So making sure that, what are some ways in which we're considering this? There's another comment in the chat, allow others to see the glass half full instead of empty in all areas of life. So being able to share those perspectives, and thank you for sharing that. One way that I've seen, when we think about just team practices, this is just one example. But one of the most powerful ways where we as leaders can shape an inclusive culture is by practicing vulnerability. Of course, your expression of vulnerability needs to have boundaries. I'm not telling you to go and stand in front of a quarterly meeting with your shareholders or business leaders and say that, oh, I don't really know what I'm doing and I'm freaking out. I'm not saying that. Brené Brown, who's one of the leaders in this field, she defines vulnerability as uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. And it's that last part that really resonates with me. Vulnerability is not a weakness. It's the most accurate measure of courage. It's a chance to be real with yourself. And in that process, you are going to open up this opportunity for other people to identify with you, to connect with you. And when people understand where you're coming from, your thought process, your decisions, they're really going to start thinking, they're going to connect. And it's going to build such a powerful bond between your business and your employees and people around you. So making sure that, we're also making them feel heard and we're able to connect with them and to be authentic with ourselves and authentic with others around us. This also ties into the second piece of just listen with empathy, listen empathetically, because creating the safe space for your team to share concerns is going to be amazing, because you're going to create the space where everyone's going to feel comfortable bringing up ideas eventually that are going to then shape the future of your business and your team and really help bring those innovative ideas forward. I've personally experienced this, with my own teams, where there are times when, team members have just shared that, hey, you know what, today I'm not feeling okay. And I need to take an hour away. I just need a mental health break. And it was so empowering in many ways, because I stepped back and it's like, you know what? Yeah, you're right. Because I can share this too. If I'm not feeling okay, I can check in. If there are ways for me to share other ideas, I already know this is a safe space, because we've established that and we've built such a strong foundation where tomorrow I'm never going to feel judged for, oh my God, was that a stupid idea? Was it okay for me to bring that up? No, all ideas are amazing. We're trying to have an open discussion. Let's create a safe space and practice vulnerability and listen empathetically so we can all come together and then impact all those other areas, right? When we talk about scaling, we talk about finances, we talk about all other areas of a business with marketing and goodness, like the list goes on and on. So really being able to think about that. There's another comment in the chat. How do we empower others to bring their authentic self to work? To answer this question, to make sure that stereotypes will not be tolerated and to show confidence by backing up with actions. And that's a very powerful thing, in the sense that as leaders, we also have our employees back, right? We're making sure that we are supporting them as they show up as their authentic self, and we're also showing confidence in their actions. And so that's a very powerful point. Thank you for sharing that. I'm going to pause here. And are there any other thoughts that come up, as we think about even team level practices, or we think about how are we really empowering others to use their voice, and sometimes even find their voice? What comes to mind? I've also found sometimes having a little bit of silence is also valuable, for us to just take back and reflect, because reflection is such a powerful way for us to just learn and have those aha moments. I invite you to share your aha moments, in the chat, or raise your hand through video, however you feel comfortable sharing. So know that we're here, we're listening, and again, this is a safe space. So as we continue to reflect, I'm bringing us to a really important question. And oops, before I go there, I see a quick comment in the chat. Affirmative responses, linguistics, especially with constructive conversations. Thank you for sharing that. Absolutely. And as we wait for more responses to come in, again, feel free to chat, feel free to comment. I also want you to know that this is a gift. This is a gift we are giving each and every one of us, because you might come up with an idea or share something that is actually going to spark this idea for someone else. So know that this isn't just a dialogue that, oh, okay, I just shared my thoughts. Your thoughts could actually change someone else's way of thinking. So thank you for all of you for speaking up and sharing your ideas. The last question, and oh my goodness, I can't believe we already have the last question, but this is the one that we're going to spend a lot of time on because this ties into all other questions for me. How might we challenge our biases to include more voices? We often generate and evaluate ideas based on what we know. I mean, I do that all the time. But here's the problem. If we use our own abilities as a baseline, we'll make decisions that work for some people, but might restrict, if anything, even exclude everyone else. The 7.4, 8 billion people in the world. And so if you focus on teams, right, we think about all this diversity in all these teams with varied physical, cognitive, emotional needs. There's no such thing as normal when it comes to people because you're all so different and we're all so unique. And so the work environments that we create really rely heavily on what people see, hear, touch. But assuming that all of those abilities are turned on and fully enabled all the time actually creates this potential to ignore this much needed range of humanity, right? This making this assumption that, oh, everyone can see, everyone can hear, everyone can speak the same way I do. Of course, everyone can understand my language, right? And so there's so many examples of this happening, but I want to walk us through this fun example. And so we're going to play a small game. So on my screen, I have two circles, A and B. Circle A and circle B are a mixture of shades of green, a little bit of shades of blue, and shades of amber as well. And the bottom one, so A and B, B is a higher contrast version of that. So for those who are perceiving this information on the screen, what number do you see in the dots? There's no right or wrong answers. This is not a pop quiz, I promise. Okay, I see Trini messaging in the chat saying this is a test for color blindness. And yes, so as we go on, for me, I see the numeral 6. Personally, for me, the bottom 6 is more clear for me. The top 6 is actually a little fuzzy for me, personally. On my screen, I now have a grayscale version of both of those. And right now, what happens? Right now, based on this perspective, we see a very different perspective of the number. On my screen, I now have these two gray circles that depict how a person with color blindness or reduced color would perceive the same circles. And when we think about even just something as color blindness affects 1 in 12 men and 1 in 200 women. Let that sink in. 1 in 12 men and 1 in 200 women. So if you are in a meeting of 100 or 200 people, there's a chance there's at least one person who's colorblind, potentially, very high probability. And so making an assumption that they can distinguish color can lead to a lot of issues, right? Because you're excluding them. There's actually 300 million colorblind people worldwide, approximately. It includes Mark Zuckerberg, it includes Bing Crosby, it includes Bill Clinton, and Prince William. So, hey, if you're making a presentation or a talk for any of them, make sure you don't convey meaning with color. And one other example of that, where we see color used is the use of charts. We love our charts. We love our data, right? We want to be able to showcase that in a fun way, in an easy way, which is great. But making the assumption that, red is bad and green is good, on just showcasing that, not everyone might be able to see it. So on my screen, I now have a bar graph with red and green colors showcasing letters on the x-axis, numbers on the y-axis. I am currently perceiving a green colored bar as the letter D as, having some high value. I'm like, okay, maybe this looks interesting. But for someone who cannot distinguish color as well, would actually find this very difficult to perceive this information presented. I can make this even more clearer. So now on my screen, I have the same chart in different shades. And so when we're thinking about, all hands meeting or sending out these emails and using data and charts to convey information, think think beyond yourself and your abilities, right? Before you send that email as yourself, ask yourself, have I presented information in an equitable manner? What are some other ways in which other people might perceive this information? And so again, on my screen now, I added a chart with the different colors. It's now shades of blue. I've also additionally added numbers. So I'm not making an assumption that, oh, everyone's going to perceive and understand this chart the same way, even if they could see it. In this case, actually, cognitive bias plays a role, right? If I send this chart out, it will be my cognitive bias with the assumption that, oh, everyone is thinking and experiencing the same thing. And I can assume that this is exactly what they're thinking and feeling. Bias is such a uniquely human attribute. I mean, it happens to all of us. What's important is to recognize it so we can make sure it's not working against us, right? In some cases, the bias might even be subconscious, where we honestly might not be aware that we're experiencing it. And so my goal for the next 5 to 10 minutes is to really challenge us to examine our biases and how that affects us in the decisions we make. So with this information, how will you challenge yourself to think beyond yourself and your abilities, right? We talked about how sometimes we might lose our own abilities and biases as a starting point. We might end up building experiences, products. I mean, think of everything your businesses are doing. Are they providing a program? Are they building an actual product? I mean, I don't know. Are you building a messenger? Are you providing software? Whatever you're doing, whatever service you're providing, whatever goodness you're providing out into the world or trying to, how do we make sure that this isn't something that's only geared towards the people of, just age, gender, language ability, tech literacy, physical ability? How are we considering the diversity of all of that? And so challenge our own biases to really start seeing human diversity as a resource for better decision making. So let's broaden out that lens, right? We think about accessibility. Again, accessibility is making sure we're providing services, technology for people with disabilities, to making sure that they're included. But taking even a step back to say inclusion, I want to make sure my product is accessible to a wheelchair user. It's accessible to someone who speaks a different language. It's accessible to someone who's temporarily sick. It's accessible to someone who's a new parent, right? And so on my screen, I now have an image, a graphic with various figures that showcase permanent, temporary, and situational disabilities or exclusions, so to speak, in the areas of touch, see, hear, and speak. Sometimes you tend to focus in on the permanent disabilities. My grandfather, he lost his eyesight. It's very easy to jump in and focus in on the outlier, so to speak, right? But thinking about exclusion as being even temporary or situational, even a short-term injury will affect the way people interact with the world around them, even if it's for a short time, right? So think about sitting on the beach and reading a book, or wearing a cast because you had a broken bone, or ordering dinner in a foreign country, you don't know the language. So temporarily, you're having a communication barrier, communication exclusion. So for example, right, if you're looking at this is very personal to me because I'm going through a wrist injury right now. And so it's very hard for me sometimes to, pick up very heavy objects. I'm actually having a very similar experience to someone who would have one arm, or someone who has an arm injury, or someone who's a new parent just holding their baby in one arm. So visualize you're coming back from the grocery store and you're grabbing everything, and I hate making multiple trips to the car. Like, that is not me. I want to drag everything and come back at the same time, right? And so imagine you're grabbing all your grocery bags and you're trying to open the door. Those twisty knob things for doors that are so difficult, where you have to set down everything you have and then open the door? Versus what if you just had a handle and you could just use your elbow to get inside? Or even another easier way where there's a button that you can click and it opens the door for you. We're all experiencing the same exclusion, and it's all dependent on the design, right? So we really think about the environment is what's disabling you. It's got nothing to do with the person. So what kind of environment are we designing for our employees? What kind of environment are we creating in our business that might be potentially disabling someone, or creating some form of a barrier? And it really challenged you to think about that, right? Thinking about how even these things can play out in a situational way. As people move through different environments, their abilities can change dramatically. Airports are a good example, right? Where it's so loud, it's so difficult to hear. You're trying to have a conversation. If you had captions in that moment, it would really make it easier, right? And so we're looking at captions, for example, being an innovation that started, for the deaf community, but has really empowered so many more people. We think about cognitive disabilities, we think about loud environments, we think about even language barriers. I was doing a talk from Munich, Germany, and I don't speak German. I don't understand German. And I was one of the only speakers speaking in English. And I really wanted to know what they were talking about. I was like, I don't know what's going on. And so I go out there, we try to look up, I translate. I'm like, oh, now I know what they're talking about, because I could use the technology for translating the language to now feel included, right? But if that didn't exist, I would have just sat through the presentations and been completely clueless on what's going on. So that's, a very simple example to really think about how do we adapt, with these hybrid work cultures, and how do we make sure that we're being inclusive through different transitions. As your businesses go through different transitions, as you scale up, you're going to be facing new challenges, right? You're going to be facing different challenges. And so how do you make sure that we go through it? My only call to action for all of you is think back and ask yourself, this was a lot of information, but what is the one thing that you are going to go and try starting today? With your business, share back with your colleagues, share back with other people. Start with that one thing. What is that one thing that you're going to go do?
Awesome, Nandita. Thank you so much for giving such an incredible overview. Certainly made me think about a lot of the way that I do things, and just in terms of like creating graphics and writing copy, considering those other perspectives that I might not have personally experienced, but are out there, and wanting to create that inclusion. So I just love it. Thank you so much. So if you are in the audience and you have a question for Nandita, please make sure to submit it in the Q&A function. We'll try to get to all of them. So first, I kind of want to ask, like, if you're an entrepreneur, like really early, like maybe you're like an aspiring entrepreneur and you're kind of like, you're thinking about like, oh, you have an idea for a product or service, whatever it may be. What are some ways that what are some questions that entrepreneur can ask themselves about their business to better understand whether they're really in a position to like lead the charge on solving that issue or filling that need?
And when you say solving that issue, filling that need, just to be a little bit more specific, are we talking about the problem that the business is trying to solve, or are we talking about the culture itself?
Yeah. So like more towards like the product development process.
Absolutely. And I feel, and let me know if this answers the question or not, but I think we also need to be mindful of resources, right? Like across different companies, depending on where you are in your journey and your maturity, resources are going to look very different, right? So you might say, okay, in my product development cycle, I'm trying to provide this XYZ service. Here are the other features that I can add that are suddenly going to increase my customer base from X to Y, right? And that's another reason I like looking at this from the lens of inclusion, where it's so easy to get overwhelmed with, oh my God, there's so many things, so maybe I'm just not going to do anything, right? Instead of saying, let me start with the one thing, right? So something as simple as, I'm trying to literally grab the first thing I see. So a mason glass, right? I have a mason jar that I use as a water. So if my goal is, okay, I want more people to try and use this product, right? I'm trying to scale, I'm trying to think of, how to address this and get more people to use it. Well, right now, let's say this is heavy. This is actually pretty heavy. It's like glass. This is so heavy. So if I had my grandparents that may have not little dexterity or not as much strength, they might not be able to use it. If I have kids and I'm worried about them throwing this somewhere and that there's glass everywhere, guess what? They're not getting to touch this, right? So you're starting to think about these different places where if you could solve for those problems, look at these constraints as an opportunity to think creatively, to then increase your user base, because then that means that directly ties to revenue, right? That directly ties to your finance. So if you can make very intentional choices and understand, okay, here are some ways in which adding this feature X is suddenly going to increase my user base to Y, which is actually adding more revenue, Z. This is great, right? This is a direct line of impact. So being able to also looking at it from different lenses, does that answer the question? Does that answer the question, Michelle?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, that's super helpful. And so kind of, I wanted to quickly touch on the image that you shared at the end, kind of, talking about like permanent, temporary, and situational disabilities. So now looking at, again, product services, but even like the workplace culture, what are some ways that entrepreneurs can, or founders can, ensure that the products, the services, and most importantly, the workplace environment for those team members that are making it happen are inclusive and accessible to all of these individuals?
That is such a beautiful question. And the answer is, I don't want to say it depends, but honestly, it depends.
Yeah.
It's a lot, right? Because if you start a step back to say, okay, what all can I do, right? Different companies have employee resource groups where they use that as a forum to be able to get feedback and listen and, also build community. The biggest thing is just listen to your employees, and find mechanisms to get that feedback and bake that feedback in, because it goes a long way for someone to say, okay, I felt heard. Sure, I know this isn't happening right now. And there's enough transparency. Someone in the chat had mentioned honesty and being able to have an honest communication and open communication. That's honestly what this is about, right? Because even if you can't provide it at that moment due to resource limitations, due to time, due to whatever, at least you've taken the effort to listen. And by creating that forum to listen, it's going to change everything. So to me, I almost look at culture goes from the top down, also goes from the bottom up, right? So from the top down, as a leader, you want to make sure that your managers are all in the same mode. And that technically does not take money. It's behavioral changes, right? It's going to take money for training. But if you're thinking about just simple behavioral changes, you can start adding where, okay, have I made sure my employees have felt heard? Am I maybe having a listening session once a quarter? Am I just having a way for employees to reach out, connect, and share their thoughts and concerns? It isn't always about, oh, here's the morale budget, throw some free food at the problem and the culture problem is solved. It doesn't work that way.
Totally. Yeah. Absolutely. Okay. So I have a couple follow-up questions to that. So, in kind of like assuming the disclosure of a disability, on the part of an employee, what measures can the founder take to address any potential stigma that might be associated with such a disclosure?
This is such an HR question.
It's okay if you don't have
out there. I'm joking, but honestly, disclosure is very personal. It's extremely personal. And I feel just being able to understand and acknowledge that is step number one, because you can't force someone to disclose. There is definitely a lot of stigma around disclosure. I mean, I feel that can be its own talk. So if anyone has questions around that, please reach out. This is a very personal topic for me as well. I think from the employee perspective, I think going back to being vulnerable, like if you want to reduce the stigma around, making sure this is a comfortable environment and an authentic environment for people with disabilities, people, everyone, be authentic. Don't be afraid to share, I think something that I'll remember, over my different roles is to be able to see and hear leaders say, okay, you know what? Yeah, I went through this and I'm actually still going through this. I'm not okay. And I appreciate you listening. And I appreciate just being vulnerable, because when you do that, you're opening up that door for others to also be vulnerable. I used to not be this open I used to not disclose. I didn't disclose for the longest time. And I think what helped me was to see my own leadership be comfortable with disclosure. So then that kind of made it okay for me personally.
Okay.
But it's not going to be the same for everyone. So by all
Totally.
means, I do want to preface that it's a very personal choice. So you
Yeah.
may be vulnerable, but it's okay if someone else doesn't disclose. That's totally their choice. I mean, our job's to make sure that if they do, and how are we making sure we are providing an open culture of accommodations and giving them all the tools they need to be successful. Because something that works for one person will not work for the other, and making that assumption is the first bias issue that we will
Totally.
get.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. Absolutely. Okay. So one other follow-up question, which I don't think will be as HR related, hopefully, but what are some ways that businesses can like collaborate with external entities like a disability advocacy organization or like accessibility experts to enhance their understanding and support of individuals with a disability?
That's an amazing question. And I'm actually going to break this down into two tiers, right? Because again, I want to be respectful of resources. Not everyone will have access to the same resources, size of the company, things like that. Conferences are a great way of doing that. There's accessibility focused conferences. Microsoft has Ability Summit. That's a great way to connect. But there's Access You, there's CSUN, there's Ali too. I mean, oh my gosh, the list goes on and on. So there's conferences in the United States, but even conferences globally that happen. So in general, I found accessibility related conferences are a great way to just kind of understand, here's what someone else is doing, here's what I can go and learn. Here are some ways, some ideas for me to bring back. I think other ways to do that, there are a lot of other resources and other learning platforms. I've seen things on YouTube, for example. I know we're live streaming on YouTube today, and there's a lot of information there. There's some really incredible books written as well that can, help someone who's just trying to learn and get into it. Reach out. I'm happy to also like share specific ones that have worked for me. But if you find other resources, please share them back.
Of course, exactly. It's that back and forth that makes us grow. Okay, that's awesome. Okay, so looking then more at like the high level, as organizations are kind of, doing business planning and like thinking about their long-term growth, what strategies can they employ to ensure consistency in practicing and promoting accessibility and inclusion over time?
So let me just say that back so I'm answering the right question. So as we're thinking about long-term growth, so in many ways kind of tied to scaling, right? So as we're scaling up, moving to the next thing, how do we make sure we're thinking about accessibility inclusion?
Yeah, just like maintaining that consistency as the business is like really growing rapidly.
Yeah, I think for me, I mean, I love metrics. I'm all about the metrics. So for me, I almost look at that as set the goal, put it in your roadmap, know that the roadmap adjusts, and know that your strategy changes, right? Based on your economic conditions, based on everything that are going on. So there will be modifications that you can make. But, when we talk about consistency, it's not necessarily always the same velocity. Those can be two different things, right? Sometimes we feel that, oh, I have to keep moving. Like if I'm giving my 100% today, I have to keep doing that all the time. And that's great if you can, kudos to you. But also be kind to yourself. And you're starting off a new business, you're moving things, you're scaling things, that's going to come with its own challenges. To me personally, what's most important that I've seen is moving the right direction. Just make sure you're consistently moving in the right direction. So if you do care about accessibility, you care about inclusion, make sure that's in your roadmap and it's represented, right? When you're thinking about building products, right? Set that goal that, okay, I'm going to have at least one feature, I'm going to have at least one initiative that's going to tie back to this. I'm going to care about diversity, equity, inclusion, disability, and there's at least one way I'm going to do that. And then here's how I'm going to measure that, right? And then share those success stories out, because you don't have to do all the heavy lifting, right? Like reach out to your colleagues. I think you brought up another really interesting question, which this ties back to your previous question, right? How can you collaborate with other entities? I mentioned conferences, I mentioned resources, but there's a lot of nonprofits in the area, like, right? Overall areas in the space. There's a lot of nonprofits you can collaborate with. Academic institutions are also really amazing, where they are trying to foster that culture and try to teach students, and it's a good way to, also build that partnership. But get creative with how you're doing that. So sometimes if you feel you're going to be low on resources, you can find other ways to leverage that. That's kind of where the collaboration also comes in.
Yeah, that's awesome. So many great ideas. And then I had, I think we have time for maybe one more question. So I was wondering, where does the line get drawn, or like, how do you kind of balance like having these conversations with employees or team members who may have some type of disability, whether it's permanent, temporary, situational, without kind of like forcing them to be the educator in that area or like the spokesperson?
The burden is real. I think that's a good call out, because we also look at this in other spaces where the other advocacy, social advocacy spaces, this comes up a lot, where the burden of education shouldn't necessarily be on the person. And I think there's an actual term for it. I think it's literally like education fatigue or something like that. Don't quote me on that, but there's literally, it is so real. On the other hand, I think it depends from person to person. I think when we talk about the line, it's very difficult to generalize this and say that, okay, you need to do this. Obviously, generally speaking, it's always good to do your own research first, but it all comes down to that person, right? If they prefer to take that moment to educate you, and if they do, great, that's their choice. And if they don't, then know that, just extend them the same kindness you would have wanted, where they're like, okay, like I don't have the mental space and capacity for this, and that's okay. So to answer your question, I think that line changes. It changes from person to person, and it'll change from time to time, because we underestimate the amount of stress or the amount of work or the other things that are going on, right? We think about our intersectional identities. There's a lot that's going on, and so we might underestimate what's going on with someone else. And so it's not like they don't want to educate you or they don't want to share. It's just at that moment.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think that's so important to consider. And like, you can just kind of like ask, kind of move through your conversations with that philosophy in your mind. I love it. Okay. So, we're almost running out of time, but if you had a key takeaway, piece of wisdom that you carry with you, or something from, this, your presentation or this conversation that you really wanted to leave with the audience, what would that be?
Be curious, right? Just challenge yourself and be curious, and don't make the assumption that everyone's going through the same lived experience as you are. And if you walk in with that lens, no matter if you're a leader, you're an employee, you're a board member, it doesn't matter what your role is, you're really going to see that change the conversations around you. And don't underestimate what one action can do, right? Or what that one conversation can do, because you are going to change and impact lives in ways that you would have never imagined. So don't ever underestimate that power of that one action. So think back and reflect on what is that one thing you can go change today, and go after it. And once you get that, then move on to the next thing.
Amazing, Nandita. Thank you so much for sharing these incredible insights and perspectives on behalf of the entire NASDAQ Entrepreneurial Center and everyone in attendance today. We are just so thankful that you joined us.
Thank you for having me. And again, feel free to reach out on LinkedIn if there's other questions that come up. Happy to share that. If I know I've solved some other open questions, with the business plan and things like that. So yeah, if you have other questions around advocacy for your own spaces that you're in, again, also happy to help. So reach out.
Awesome. Thank you, Nandita. And to everyone in our audience, we would love for you to join us again for upcoming webinars, which you can view by using the link that's going to be posted in the chat. Thank you all so much for joining us today, and we look forward to welcoming you back online with us soon.